Friends, last week we took a quick look at the first ever SUV that has two electric motors driving two separate axles that is a full plug-in hybrid vehicle. Now let's go back to the XC90, but spend a little bit more time looking at the car and the platform itself. And this time let's look at the turbocharged and supercharged T6. So to really unpack the engine, we need to step back and talk theory. So Volvo has taken the decision to go with all four-cylinder engines. Now there's a lot of moving parts to a decision like that. There's the very obvious one of, hey, we're trying to get more efficiency, but still maintaining the power of a larger engine. And then there's complexity. Like if you look at the previous Volvo engine family, it used to be 5 engines. There was 2 each of 4 cylinders and 2 each of 5 cylinders, and then there was a V8 at the top. Now they've structured that down to 2 engines. But if I'm really reading between the lines here, one of the biggest benefits is packaging. Think about it, if you have a smaller power plant to package, that gives you a lot more really flexibility in form. So like, take a look at the front of this car, and you guys know I'm a frustrated designer. This is a production car, but the front end has the proportions of a concept car. That's one of the major benefits of making this smaller. Anyway, I digress. So let's talk about this engine. So this is a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine, puts out 316 horsepower, and then it's 295 pound-feet of torque. Now you're probably asking yourself, how do you get 316 horsepower out of a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine? Well, you could easily slap a turbocharger or two to this engine. Well, Volvo decided not to do that. They got a new guy running the engine group, and they decided to go with a turbocharger and a supercharger. But how does that work? Well, that's all a function of what the driver is asking for in terms of torque, or really the load under acceleration. So let's say, for the sake of discussion, there's a light acceleration load. The engine will operate as if normally aspirated and then hand off to the turbocharger. But then let's say, hey, I'm a New Yorker, I'm gonna stick my foot into it, I want more power. Well, that's when the supercharger is going to kick in first. And then from there, the supercharger hands over to the turbocharger. Now, why does it do that? Well, that's efficiency. The supercharger, like any old school supercharger that you saw on like cars with superchargers sticking out of the hood, it's mechanical. It still takes load off of the accessory drive. Yeah, there's a clutch that can turn it on and off, but it still takes load off the accessory drive when it's in use. So it gives you that extra power that you need, or really the torque that you need, and then it hands off to the turbocharger, because think about it, the turbocharger is using the spent exhaust gas, thus more efficient. Get it? So an all 4-cylinder engine strategy, that's a pretty bold move, but it's not the first time that we've seen this. If you remember back to 2010, when we first drove the then new 2011 Sonata, they did an all 4-cylinder strategy, but that's a totally different segment. That is an affordable D-segment family car. This, yes, a family car or SUV, but this is a luxury car. So even people that are not car people, they're gonna want performance from their XC90. So the question is, do you still have engine performance? Like, is this thing got enough power? And now I've been driving this thing, I want to say almost 2 days out here in the canyons, and there really hasn't been an instance where I have wanted more power. The turbocharger working in conjunction with the supercharger, really plenty of power. There's never an instance where it's like peaky, where it gets to a point where it's an on or off switch like old school turbos. It's very much a wide power band. With that said, it doesn't have quite the refinement of a V6 or an inline 6, or definitely not that of a V8. So is that a problem? Well, if this had a porcelain roundel on the hood, I'd say, yeah, that's definitely a problem. But Volvos, they go after a different customer. So I would say this is actually more powerful and exceeds the expectations of most people that are buying Volvos. So in the T8 episode, we covered the suspension a bit, but just to recap, there are two suspensions on offer. There's a steel spring setup that has a very cool transverse leaf spring in the rear here, much like a Corvette. And then there is an air suspension that's on offer. It's fitted to this one here, and every T8 that comes to the US will have the air suspension. It basically does two things. It adjusts the ride height, but it also adjusts the dampers. And it does that through the drive mode system. Now the drive mode system does adjust more than the suspension. It adjusts the throttle mapping, transmission mapping, but in the case of the dampers, it stiffens up the dampers, so it drastically changes the driving dynamics of the car, and we'll get to that later. There's another trick in the off-road mode. It brings the height up by 2 inches, but when the car then goes to 20 miles an hour or above, it brings it back down to a normal ride height. And speaking of height, there's another trick here, and you know, I've never told you guys that sometimes I have the mentality of a 3-year-old, and I love toys like this. And I could only imagine, like the kids of the parents that buy these things, my guess is they'd probably play with this thing to the point of breaking it. Okay, let's fiddle with this air suspension, and we do that by adjusting the drive modes using this beautifully knurled drive mode button here. And we are currently in comfort mode, and Volvo bills it everyday use. And I would completely agree with that. Granted, we are not in an everyday application right now, being in canyons, but it really demonstrates that in this mode you do get a bit of understeer. It's not the most confidence-inspiring mode, but then again, I don't really see the average family buying this car coming out and carving canyons. Okay, let's step down one level and go to the eco mode, which Volvo calls the efficient drive mode. And basically what this does, it adjusts the throttle, becomes a bit softer. It changes the throttle mapping, the transmission mapping, and obviously the suspension a bit. And really, the engine is focused more on efficiency than it is performance, even from the normal mode. So really it's trying to avoid using that supercharger. There is, if you notice here, an off-road mode, but notice it's grayed out like in a computer, like it wouldn't be available, and that's because we're going over 20 miles an hour. So to engage that, you need to be going below 20 miles an hour, and then it brings the suspension up 2 inches. Okay, now that we've covered all the compulsory modes for the tree huggers of the audience, I say we have some fun, and let's go to the dynamic mode. The dynamic mode, once again, changes the throttle mapping, the transmission mapping, but most importantly changes the dampers. So it completely stiffens up the dampers. The throttle, totally different. It's a little stiffer throttle, but much more responsive. And notice the driving dynamics around corners, the car doesn't lean as much. There isn't much body roll in the rear at all. It's like a totally different vehicle. Like this is where you feel like you got a 6-cylinder, almost even an 8-cylinder in some cases. It's just plenty of power. Notice we got a nice declining radius turn coming up here. I'm going to slow down going into it and see how composed this is. This is a 2.5-ton vehicle, people, and we're going around a turn. I'm not going to tell you the speed, but not what we should be doing in a vehicle like this. So now let's press on to suspension and architecture. So up front, we've got a short, long arm, basically double wishbone setup, and in the rear, you got a multi-link suspension. Now, the real interesting thing about this is the product architecture. So do you guys remember when we did that Audi Volkswagen MQB episode with Nick Uhas, and we learned about how Volkswagen's going to be building a number of different cars off of the same vehicle architecture? Well, Volvo is looking to do the same thing here. They're calling it Scalable Product Architecture, or SPA. Sounds a little bit better than MQB. And the logic is really the same. Take like hard points, shared hard points of cars, or even tools like suspension underpinnings, sub-assemblies, things like that. Share them amongst different cars in different segments, different sizes, to be able to kind of spread the development cost over multiple cars. But here's really the interesting note. I was having dinner with one of the engineers last night, and he was saying that this 2015, and this is going to be a 2016 model year car. He was saying that this is going to be the oldest car in the Volvo lineup in 2018, when it's 3 years old. Okay, let's focus on the interior, and the place to start is the seats. So if we go back to like old school Volvos, I don't mean like 1927, I mean like 240 DLs, the seats, they were very specific. They had a function and they worked very well. But Volvo decided to go with a clean sheet of paper here, and they hired orthopedists from university hospitals to look at their seats. And the orthopedists came up with two suggestions. Number one, make the seat padding a bit thinner. And number two, and most importantly, the seat back to make it the same shape as the spine. The result definitely works. Then there's a couple of